welcome to the Art of Being Human. At the end of last segment, I started talking to you about the stages that people go through when they've lost somebody, and the focus is on we went through the first part of it, where you have a lot of numbness and you're like in a different reality. Everything is numb, and you're not quite thinking right, and all of that. Once that phase leaves, and the busyness of the funeral kind of counteracts that kind of numbness that you feel. Once that's over with, which can be as much as a month or more, although I think is usually quite a bit shorter than that, it usually starts wearing off when the funeral is finished and the people leave, and you suddenly realize you're alone with all your emotions. It's that second emotional stage that I want to deal with, because that's very powerful, and it's very painful, and it's very difficult to deal with. Some of the emotions you would have on that second stage would be longing for the person to be back. And sometimes that's called an episodic pain, when you just got to have the person back. You really need to have that person back. But of course the person doesn't come back. Then this panic and this helplessness and this loneliness, which I've alluded to before. Anger, resentment, depression, self-pity. And this is part of all of the emotions that you have. Now, this section of the grief process, when you're going through all of those emotions, that can last months. It can last years. There's no timing it. You know, the emotions are very deep, and they're very powerful, and you're very lonely, and you have a lot of anger. Anger goes along with it. Anger is a part of the grief process. However, people get guilty because then they shouldn't be angry. How can you be angry at a person who died? After all, they couldn't help it. I mean, they didn't make the choice to die. It was that they did die, but it's not that they planned it that way. So then you feel guilty about feeling angry, but you don't have anything to feel guilty about. Whatever you're feeling after a person has died, consider it to be a part of the grief process, because it's going to be a part of the grief process. The person has died and you're angry at them. You're angry at them for leaving you in a mess. You're angry at them because they left you when you needed them. And so you can yell and scream at them. They're not going to hear you, but you can yell and scream at them, and that's a normal process of the grief. You have to be, you just have to be in tune with the fact that if you're angry, that's a normal way to feel. Don't feel guilty because you're angry, because your emotions are so in such an upheaval that you can't depend upon your emotions to be stable at all. They're not going to be stable at all. So people take a week or so off when they have a loss, and they go to the funeral and all of that. Then they go back to work the following week as if nothing's ever happened. And they'll say, and people will say, well, how are you doing? Oh, I'm doing okay. But actually, you're not doing okay, because there's a lot more to go through. Nothing is the same. There's no rules. There's no timetable for grief. I remember hearing a pastor saying, well, I should have given my wife more time to grieve to get over her loss. And I'm thinking, how do you time something like that? You can't time it. You can't say, oh, you're over the grief in 1 or 2 weeks, or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and that's enough. You've had time to grieve, now get back to normal. It is uncomfortable for people to see people grieve. And the feeling is they wish that they kind of get over it and move on with life. But the thing is, nothing's the same, and they can't just get over it and move on with life. There is a substance in crying. Crying is very good for a person if they're grief-stricken. There is a substance in tears which helps to detoxify the human body. It helps to get the toxins out of the human body, and they do feel better afterwards, and they feel lighter. So there is a physical reason why tears are actually a good thing. But no one wants to make a spectacle of themselves. Nobody wants to be crying and not able to stop. But that's what happens sometimes. A funeral is loaded with tears. And sometimes you go to a funeral and hardly anybody is crying, and they're just sitting there, and you wonder, what are they really going through? And someone will say, well, how were the people? Did they do okay? Yeah, they did fine. They didn't cry. But that shouldn't be the measure of doing fine. We can say a person is fine because they didn't cry, but maybe they should have. You know, that would be the time to do it. And you wouldn't have to worry about it. It would be a normal thing if it happened. So crying is helpful. And it also helps to deal with anger and helplessness and frustration. The anger comes, I think, from the feeling of helplessness. Helplessness oftentimes turns to rage. And now here I'm kind of stepping to one side. There is a psychologist whose name was Rollo May, and he's no longer with us. This is years ago, but he wrote some books on anger and what it did. And what he said did, a person feels helpless. And when they feel helpless because they can't make a change, then they start to feel very depressed. And then they start to feel very, very angry. That anger turns to rage. All of that depression and the slowness turns to rage, and you've got to be angry at something. Somebody has to take the blame for all of the problems that you're having. So usually you don't blame yourself, although you may. Usually you don't like to blame the person who's sick, but that's what happens in a death situation. They died, and they left you behind, and then you have all of the stuff that you have to go through, the change in your life status, the change in how you feel, and you have to do something about it, and you get angry, and why did you leave me? You shouldn't have left me. You left me all alone. I've got the 3 kids to raise. I don't have a job. How am I going to do it without you? It's all your fault. Why did you die? Now, it sounds pretty immature, but it's not immature at all. It's a part of the grief process. People do it all the time. You have to let that out. You have to let all of those emotions out. And then you can kind of reconstitute yourself and start thinking in a different way. Okay, I've got the 3 kids to raise, but I have a job. I can ask for more hours on my job. Someone will help me to take care of them if I have to go into work or when I have to go into work. And so you start thinking more rationally. This is what I can do to get myself over the hump. This is what I have to do to help my children, because they've got to get over the hump too. You know, it's going to affect them. What affects you as an adult is going to affect your children, if you have children. And so they have to work with that as well. And so you have a new reality. Out of your being able to get conditioned to doing new things that you hadn't done before, and out of that new reality starts your new life. And all of a sudden you start thinking, well, wait a minute, I have to pay for the newspapers on Tuesday. I have to go to the dentist on Thursday. I have to do this, and I do the groceries, which my husband used to do. I've got to make out a grocery list. What do we really need? How are my kids doing? Do they need special help? Do they need to see a counselor over this death? Am I treating them in the way that I should treat them so that they can recover from this? Because this is going to be a shock to them too. They know something's wrong. They know he's not alive, but they don't understand what it means, you see, because a child doesn't have formal brain development. The child's brain is not developed until they're in their mid-20s. So what does it mean to them to lose somebody and not be able to ever have them back? That's really strange. They may not understand that concept. As a matter of fact, adults don't do so well with it either sometimes. So everything has to get reoriented. You have to learn how to do the groceries. You have to learn how to pay the bills. You have to learn how to pick up the prescriptions. You have to learn how to drive the kids to school or to their games. You have to be a mentor for them. You have to do the things that your spouse used to do. And I'm thinking in terms really now in terms of the widow, but what if it's a widower? It's the same thing. How do you get children used to the fact they no longer have a mom? I know when my father died, my 3- and 4-year-old niece and nephew decided that what they really wanted to do was get a balloon and fly the balloon up to heaven and take their grandfather back down again. Why can't we do that? And to them it seemed like a logical conclusion. They wouldn't understand the finality of death. No, you can't do that. It won't work. They don't understand that. Well, if he's up there, bring him back down. He doesn't have to stay up there, does he? You have to think of it like in terms of how a 2-year-old or 3- or 4-year-old would see it. They're not going to see it rationally because their brains aren't developed to the point where they can. They don't understand it. They just don't. Adults a lot of times don't understand it either. And so they go on these wild thought trips. Well, we can do this and bring him back. We can do that and bring him back. Or, what do you mean he's not coming back? I don't understand what that means. And you have to be careful how you answer their questions because they now can develop fears. Fears of going to sleep because if their grandfather fell asleep, if it's described to them he went to sleep, but it's a permanent sleep, what's to prevent them from having a permanent sleep and not coming back? You see, they're going to get it all twisted up because they don't have the language skills to understand it. They only understand that there's a terrible loss. It makes no sense to them at all. And it doesn't make much sense to the parents either. And they see the parents grieving, and they don't know what that means, but they know that there's a loss somehow. Now, children who live on a farm and animals die, they have maybe more of a concept, but it's not the same thing as an adult concept would be. So you have to deal with what their perceptions are. That means you have to know what their perceptions are. You can't help them if you don't know what they're thinking. And sometimes they'll let you know what they're thinking, but sometimes they can't. Not necessarily that they want to keep it secret, they just don't have the language structure at their young ages to be able to talk. They can talk some, but they can't talk a lot because they don't have the language structure for it. When you're talking about 3- and 5-year-olds, they don't have a lot of language structure. They can talk, but they get mixed up. And everything gets twisted around. So it helps if you understand that the emotions that a person is feeling after the death has occurred, the frustration, the anger, the helplessness are all normal. And that helplessness turns to rage, turns to anger and turns to rage because they can't do anything about the situation. They can't change the situation. And that's where you get the sense of helplessness from. And that helplessness turns to anger and rage. So it's not unusual if you stop to think of the sequence that a person who is going to go through a bereavement, a person who's going to be suffering a loss, they follow that pattern. They can get very angry at the person who died, leaving them alone, especially if they had a good relationship with them and if their lives would be very good. Now, in the case of Dr. Joyce Brothers, she had a good relationship with her husband, and she was married to him for over 40 years, and she used to come home and they used to talk about their day, and I did this and you did that. There's bantering back and forth over a cup of coffee and so forth, and it's just a very nice kind of life. There's somebody to talk to. I had a bad day and this happened, and I can now share it with my husband. Or I had a good day and this happened. I can share it with my husband. Now you drive home and there's nobody. The loneliness of driving home to her apartment when he was not there, and there was no one was going to be there to talk to, and she was just going to be there by herself thinking about what she would have told him had he been alive. And then she became angry at the illness that killed him. She became angry at the cancer that killed him, and that took her quite a long time to follow through on that and to get healing from that. It is not unusual. I am a strong believer in grief counseling, and I've done a lot of grief counseling, and it's been helpful to a lot of people because they now understand why they feel the way they feel and the normalcy of it. It is not a bad thing to get angry. It's not a bad thing to cry. It's not a bad thing to yell and scream unless you're going to be hurting yourself or hurting somebody else. The idea is just to let that expression come, because the more it comes and the more you get rid of it, then the faster it'll be that you can embrace a different kind of life that'll be your new normal, whatever that normal is going to be. Now, for Dr. Brothers, it was a help to her because she had a profession, and she could turn to her profession, and she could be busy with her profession. But still, it didn't stop the loneliness, because when the profession stopped, at the end of the seminar, whatever she was doing, then she would be just as lonely as before. You know, something happens with people who are professional, and I may as well bring it up because I'm thinking of it. People who are professional and have given their lives to their careers, whatever they may be. For a doctor or a nurse or a teacher, they've given themselves to their career. They've spent all of their time just helping with the career and nurturing it and letting it grow. And that's natural, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But the time comes, if you're a professional, especially if you're single, when you're not going to be able to do it anymore. You're going to be too old. You're not going to be able to physically keep it up. And then what happens then? You don't have any friendships because you haven't invested in friends. You've only invested in your career. And I can remember when I was teaching as a college professor, and I was doing experiments with psychology experiments that I was devising with the students, and I was having a blast. They were having a blast. It was a really good time, and I really loved doing it. I spent hours on it. And then the thought came to me, what if I lived to be like 103 or something like that? And I can't do this anymore. And my teaching career is gone because I'm too old to do it or too unhealthy to do it. Then who do you turn to for comfort and security and communication? You know, when you're busy doing all of these things, it feels good to you because it's a part of who you are. But then when you get to the point where you can't do it anymore, then what do you do then? You're sitting in your own apartment or your own room, and you're not going to be comforted because you won this award or that award, or you gave that speech or whatever it was. So you have to really realize the importance of nurturing your friends and nurturing your family and nurturing the people around you, because basically when you get to the point that you're so old you can't do it anymore, they are the ones that are going to be a support system. Looking at an award hanging on the wall is not going to be a support system for you, but your interactions with people will be a support for you. So what you have to do is you have to make plans, and you have to include your friends, your family, and nurture them and work with them, and they have to be as important to you as your career is. They should be a part of it anyway. And then when it comes to the point where you're going to retire, you're not going to do this anymore, you just can't do it anymore, then what happens? You have a backup, you have people around you, people that you can interact with. And then you're not just going to be sitting there lonely, because way back when you used to have a fabulous career. The career is gone, not because you've done anything wrong, probably because you've done everything right. But once that career is gone and you don't have a lot of family members around, or some of your friends have died, then who supports you? How do you live your life as a social person if all you did was your career and nothing else? You see, it's not very good. If you stop to think of it, you need to have a balance in your life. And the point is, with Dr. Brothers, as she expressed, she says, you know, I felt like I didn't have any friends, and I felt I didn't have a family. I felt totally alone. For the first time in 42 years, she felt like she was totally alone. The person she loved the most and depended upon the most wasn't there. And that was the cause of her anger. She didn't have what she had before. It had been taken away by his death. She had a wonderful child, but that child is across the country and has her own life with her own kids. She has her grandchildren, but it's not anyway, you wouldn't deal with them on an everyday basis if they're not living close to you. And so therefore she turned to her career. That makes her career ever more important. But then when he died, she was lonely enough that the career just wasn't enough to cut it. She did it, and she eventually got back to it. But that was that horrible period of loneliness when you feel that you have been cut off and you have nothing. And then you start to think, well, I am a nobody. You know, in our society, and she describes this in her book. I wasn't so aware of it because I've been single all my life and I haven't paid attention, I guess. But what she says, that if you are unmarried or if you're a widow, your status goes down. Somehow you failed. The marriage has failed. Somehow society looks at you as not being as important as you were. And so therefore you lose status and you lose your relationships with people who gradually fall away from you because of their own lives being busy. They can't pay that much attention to you when their own lives are busy. So gradually you lose the interchange that you have with your friends because they're drawn away by their own problems or their own families or their own busyness, and you have no one to go to. It's like everybody else has a person. Everybody else is a part of a couple or a part of a group, but you feel like you aren't. You're totally alone. You know, her kids were gone. They were grown, and her husband was gone. And you can't depend upon professional relationships to give you the deep assurance and the nurturance that you need if people are seeing you and seeing you a lot because you're a doctor or you're a nurse or you're a counselor or a psychiatrist. They're coming to see you and you're very busy seeing them and nurturing them and helping them, but they're coming on the basis of their own need. But that's not going to take care of your need when you're in a spot where you need to have the nurturance, where you need to have the interchange, where you need to have people around you that'll help you. Your business associates can't do that. They have their own lives. Your kids can't do that. They have their own lives. Unless you can nurture your family and people will be there for you when you're in need, you can feel terribly, terribly alone. And aloneness, as far as I'm concerned, is worse than depression. Depression is very treatable. How do you treat loneliness? The only way you could treat loneliness is to reattach yourself again with other organizations, with your profession again, with other people, and don't leave the people out. You know, the lectures and everything that you do that's wonderful, and there's nothing wrong with that, to keep that up. But you need to invest yourself in people because at some point, it's the people that you interchange with that are going to bring you your health back. Now, I could say more, but we're about running out of time. I want to continue with this next time. I want to particularly go into loneliness and how it can be helped, because it is a terrible problem. And it's not just from death. There are all kinds of other reasons that people are lonely, too, and I want to get into that as well. So we'll close it here. Please join me next time.